Welcome back, wannabes and creators, to a very special presentation. I am, as many of you know, I had WannaCon last weekend, and I have the ability to have this wonderful streaming setup for a couple more weeks and test it out. So I decided that I'm going to try streaming a couple of our interviews live. And today we have Mark, whose last name I should have asked before we went on stage, and how to pronounce it, because I know it's not Riechers. It's not Riechers, right?
You were close. It's Riechers. It rhymes with Snickers. As my grandmother who taught like grade school used to say.
I love it. I say it's like it's Nolte, like Nick Nolte, but spelled differently. So
nice. Oh, that's a good one.
Yes. Well, it's getting worse because Nick Nolte's quite old now, so it works for people like our age, but not for younger people. They don't understand. So that joke is aging out. We need a new Nolte that's like famous so that I can use them. Mark, we met at podcast Evolutions a couple of last month. God, it feels like forever ago.
It really does.
Like one of the last conventions that might ever exist for the rest of our lives.
The last,
now.
It was the definitive podcast movement.
The definitive podcast movement.
I think they just canceled the main one. They're like, oh, we're not sure if this is going to happen.
Well, if it's not going to happen in August, it's really tough to imagine anything happening in August, because that's like the last bastion of all these cons that are canceling now or kind of rescheduling to August.
Mm-hmm. I have stuff I go to in September, and I'm not sure if that's going to happen. Although, like, there's so many things happening, like me not being able to go to my internet conference is not really that big a deal.
Right. Well, and I have San Diego Comic-Con, which like this in July, and I make 20 to 40% of my income every year from shows. So I'm kind of freaking out and trying not to freak out and trying to go on. We're launching this big product right now, and every day I do it, I'm caught between like people need something to focus on, like that's not this big thing, and also like who cares about my like little book right now? That's like the world is coming down, and I'm trying to tell people to go and buy my little book. So I'm like literally like hour by hour, feel like a cat batting a toy back and forth.
I'm a public radio producer, and I just got out of a staff meeting where we were actually talking about this exact thing, which is like, on the one hand, we feel like we all have a lot of time and we have an audience that really, really, really wants to connect with something. It's clear like we have people writing in who are like, just post as many interviews about animals and things that are not related to what's happening so I can escape. And then there's people who are like, I want to hear your take on this. And it's like this incredible creative opportunity, but also a ton of pressure. And we're not 100%. We're not all pulling in the same direction quite yet.
Yeah, I don't know how because on one hand, I look at my podcast app feed now and I say, oh my God, like there's a lot of things about coronavirus. And I will go to whatever one that like is not about coronavirus, but then I'll open my podcast app like 20 minutes later and after that interview and be like, no, I have to know everything that's happening right now.
Yeah.
So it's crazy.
Especially since like the daily podcast has really taken off, like literally the daily, but also just the format, the daily podcast, right. Like that feeling of like, oh, we need to put something out right now that really addresses right now. Like that pressure has never felt more intense, and I think anybody who creates stuff on the internet can relate, right? I mean, it's like now in this moment where more people than ever are on the internet more often, like they're all that's basically where we're all living right now. Like, oh, so I need to be as present there as I possibly can be. Like the possibility of burnout for people in creative fields has probably never been higher.
Yeah, well, it's tough because on one hand, I really appreciate the weekly format because it gives you time to like breathe and like compose yourself and like and decide the relevancy of an idea and like really think about what you have to put out. I mean, I think that's the thing that I miss about I'm not quite old enough to remember the pre-internet days, but I remember the young internet days when like people were measured about the statements they made. And I miss those days, but on the same time, I yearn for the like immediacy of what's happening this minute.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, like I don't know how to like parse that because I feel like everybody is going through that same thing. It's like I want to disconnect and just take a walk and not think about all this stuff that's happening. But at the same time, I need to know everything that's happening because it's happening in such a rapid pace.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the nice things about podcasting is you can kind of you're putting that choice in the hand of your listeners. Like as long as you put out something that you're proud of, like, you know, they can listen to it while they're walking their dog. And then if later they just decide, you know what, halfway through this walk, I'm just going to listen to music, or I'm just going to listen to my dumb video game podcast because I've taken in as much as I possibly can. Like they can pause your show, they can come back to it when they feel like they're ready to listen to it. You know, there's a little bit more of a permanent, I mean, there's a reason why like everyone is just opening up streaming binging right now, right? They're just like anything that's like on the shelf that they can kind of consume en masse, just because like, oh, you still there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, okay, sorry, my screen went to sleep. I was like, everything went black for a second. I was like, oh god.
That is the fear that at some point I'm just gonna be looking at my computer and it's just gonna go black and I'm gonna be like, it's gonna be like, wow, this really is like the end of it all.
Yeah, I was half expecting like there to be like the purge alarm. You know, it's like, oh god, it's happening.
I mean, I saw it in your face. It was like they had that the eyes went blind. And I was like, no, that's
yeah. Okay, good.
Yeah. So aside from this, let's talk about what you're passionate about these days. And let's we talked about the world burning down. Let's bring it back down to like what you're passionate about and what gets your creative juices flowing.
Sure. So like in the context of work or just generally?
Generally, whatever you want to do. I usually try and keep it to business stuff or work stuff, but I've had people talk about like puzzles and like knitting and political things and other stuff. The only one I've cut out is the political one because I felt like that one is a little bit too close to like people's pain centers.
Yeah, that's, you know, depends on the context, but yeah, you know, I'm always, and you know, like we're like a weekly news magazine show, so everyone kind of has a different topic area of interest. Mine tends to be, you know, like to call it technology. I feel like the best technology journalists right now are really culture journalists who talk about online culture. Like no one's writing stories about like, well, I mean, I know reporters who are writing stories about like 5G internet and stuff like that. But like when I think about internet journalism, that's not really like, I think about reporters who are like looking at how communities are forming on Reddit, or, you know, like there was some trend piece about, I think the headline was just, we all live in Zoom now. And just about like, oh, well, like you have like this now critical mass of people who are just hanging out in video chats because they need that connection right now.
Mm-hmm.
So I think like just thinking about different ways that people use technology to kind of mediate connection, if that makes sense. It's like a really technocratic way of saying social media, because like social media has always fascinated me, but not really, like partially because of the creative possibilities, but also just because it's a social space. And we tend to talk about, like, we talk about Facebook like it's a company, and it is, but you know, like a place like that, I mean, I think it's, you put it in starker terms of like, you know, it's really like the world's largest country, you know, like it has the most people of anywhere on the planet. They just are all there in this online space. So I've tried to do, I think I've produced a few shows about this subject, and like it can kind of touch in different corners of the world in ways you might not expect. Like I did a whole show about, originally it was pitched as like, do we even need movie theaters anymore? Like, are they just an artifact of this time when like it was a constraint of like you had to go to this physical place to watch a movie together? And so then I think that kind of the takeaway from that show is that there are certain experiences that are just like the online thing, the online piece of it is not equivalent, and it's just not the same. And so, but that doesn't mean that both spaces don't have value. So like thinking about ways to expand like how we can kind of experience culture in online spaces, and like, not only interact with each other, but, you know, like create new norms, and like the emergence of memes, or like lately the thing for me is like, I find TikTok fascinating. Like I think it really took like diving in and understanding that it's essentially just a giant meme factory. In terms of like I don't know how familiar you are with it at all, but
I feel like it's like Snapchat, but the next evolution of Snapchat, kind of. It's like videos and stuff, or is it different? Because no, I'm gonna say no.
Yeah, so it's different. It's this collision of a bunch of different things, right? There was an app called Musically, which was essentially like a karaoke app, kind of like you would play. This is gonna be like two oldish white guys talking about the High School Kid app. Okay, so it'll be fun. No, but Musically was people essentially doing karaoke on video, and then it kind of evolved into them doing dances. So there's this component of like putting on something and then performing to it and making a short video piece about that. And then that kind of collided with Vine, which was these like 6-second comedy videos. And so then they kind of brought all that technology together, and what it's become is like, you know, you might have a video clip of like a new, like the, you know, like from a YouTube video, even like just like a single meme moment, and then you might have like you and I film a little skit where we perform parts from that video in a different context. So there's like, it's kind of like all the best parts about like weird niche internet culture. So it's like, you know, there's dog internet, because like there's dog Instagram and like pet influencers and stuff like that. So now you have like pet influencers acting out skits from YouTubers on TikTok. So it's this like weird, like kind of rock tumbler internet meme machine that just is so strange. And like, it's all built around creation. It's all built around this idea of like, we're going to lower the barrier of entry for you to create something not 100% new, but it has that early internet feel of like the remix culture aspect of things. And like, oh, everything should be free. Everything should flow. You can kind of turn something, here's 3 things, you can combine them and make something new on your own. Like it's like that in its rawest, purest form.
That does sound a lot better than what I've seen of TikTok. I mean, I've seen the things that come out of it, like Old Town Road and the surprise mother effer thing from a couple of years ago, but that's a lot different than the perception that I had of Snapchat. I still TikTok. I still think I'm past the years where like I could endure that, but I can see how that is significantly different than a lot of the other social media platforms that are out there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's underscored to me, like, probably maybe it's just because I'm getting older, or maybe it's just the way that my relationship to media, but like it made me realize how much media I just consume and don't really like. I really feel like in a certain point, if you use this app and you create TikToks on a regular basis, everything you're viewing, you're thinking about in the context of like, how can I use this to create something new that speaks to my experience? You know, it's like this goofy video that's like originally like somebody, like a live stream of The Sims that just ends with a joke about a dog doing something weird. Like that can become something that's about your life. And like you're processing everything through the lens of creating something, which, you know, like I can't say that I do for a lot of the other media I consume. So like, it's kind of cool. It feels like it's setting up a healthier relationship to media for the people who are using it. I do worry that, like, you know, it is easy to just kind of infinite scroll. It's the same problem that every social media app has, but it does feel different for some reason.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, I feel like that's how I see the world. I view the world as a creative human who like makes books and stuff. It's always like pulling from this source and pulling from this source and pulling from this source and pulling from that source and saying, well, there's nothing new, but if I take 10 sources and smash them all together, I can like create at least my take on how this is what I think of this kind of world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think like that notion of like combining a ton of different influences and kind of using it as like, you know, it's like, you know, traditionally you'd think of like as a writer, like you think about like your arsenal, like you read as many books as you possibly can, so you're literate in like all the different ways of writing, all the different tropes. And so like it feels like we're creating these spaces where like you have to be literate in video, audio, text, social media, all of these things all at once, and then they're all this rich palette you can draw from to create something new.
That's wonderful. Yeah. I mean, yeah, my favorite memes are the ones that you're like, you have to go down, you have to understand 10 different things to get this meme. And I love it so much that like it has to be so niche. But then you realize, no, it's not that niche because like it got shared like 100,000 times. So like there's 100,000 people at least that have that that sense of that like combined amount of data points, which is kind of awesome.
Yeah. No, it's like you think about like critical scholars who thought about this idea of like intertextuality and like books speaking to one another, and like you show them some of the stuff that we're consuming now. It's like literally every part of the cultural ecosystem could be colliding at any possible moment.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's just a bananas. I mean, it's a bananas world for a lot of reasons, but yeah.
Well, I love the thing you were talking about like social, about like connections online, because we live in we're recording this in like in the first real week of like most places being locked down and sending people out, and like it kind of started last week in Seattle and a couple of cities, but like most of the big cities that I know are like kind of starting this shutdown, at least in like the major cities on the coast, maybe some cities in the middle. Actually, is really weird because I was listening to the Weeds this morning, and they were like, you don't seem to most people don't understand that there are people that are dealing with this on a daily basis in the cities. And then there are people in like spring break that like have a very different idea of what this whole thing is. And like in smaller towns where like it's not hitting them. And so it doesn't seem real. And I find that idea fascinating, that like we're having like almost two different experiences of this virus and this time in world history.
Yeah, I mean it's a weird moment, you know, like I'm sorry, I just lost my train of thought.
It's okay. Yeah. It's hard. It's hard to express it in words, like what?
Yeah.
Because I try to keep this show not about that stuff, and my marketing not about that stuff. But sometimes it has no choice but to seep in. Like it's like so. But I love that this idea that online spaces, and like how do we make online spaces more connection oriented, like you would go out to a bar and see your friends, even if it's just online, even if it's online. I know I listened to Seth Godin's podcast, Akimbo, and he for the whole month is setting up these like virtual workspaces on Zoom where people can just go in and work and not talk and just like work together. I know my wife. My wife's office is doing the same thing, where like a lot of their teams just are like on conference calls all day together, and then like in case they need each other, which is sort of like we're growing into this like world where like where you're smashing you're smashing into the online world and the real life world, like at a speed that may have taken 10 years to do, and we're doing it all in like 3 days.
Yeah, totally. Like you definitely like but there are all kinds of, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of great stories of people in kind of like intergenerational places or like big workplaces where maybe part of the workforce was working online before, but not all of them. And now all of a sudden everybody is forced into that same context, that there's just like today we were on an all staff call, and I think somebody just hit the mass unmute button and just unmuted every single person on the conference call. That was like 200 people. And it was just this chaotic moment where all of a sudden you were just getting streams of every single person's like home office setup. And like, it was actually kind of beautiful in a weird way, because it did feel like we were all in the same place, but you did realize just like how chaotic that is, and how like a controlled technologically, like we can use technology to kind of like artificially focus, like it's just the two of us, it's ignoring, like anybody who might be watching this or like anyone else in your house or mine. But like, I don't know. It's like we're trying to like recreate physical spaces in this moment, because it's like, okay, well, that's the closest thing we have to a middle ground.
Yeah, well, we saw. I've been looking. Have you seen Netflix Party yet?
No.
So Netflix Party is this site where you and your friends can. It's I think it's an extension for Chrome, maybe probably other platforms too, and you can basically have like watch the same thing together and have like a video stream, and but all you're on it together, and you're all doing like the same chat and watching the thing at the same time. And I mean, humans are social creatures. Like we are, but we're also very adaptable. So like if all the movie theaters are going to go down, I love that somebody like the next day is like, well, maybe I create a thing where we can all watch Netflix together all over the country then.
Right. Yeah. No. And like, but it's also like totally logical, right? Because like the whole argument is that if you are going to go to the movie theater, the only reason you're going is so you can watch it with other people. So as soon as that gets taken away, it's like, oh, well, and that's, I think, like technology at its most beautiful is in moments like that, where someone's just like, well, if I took this thing and combined it with this thing, like I can solve this problem that actually exists. Like, it's not just creating stuff for the sake of anything. It's like, oh, I'm solving a problem that is like, either helping people consume culture in a way that is more constructive for them, or like create things together. Or like, I think the other thing I've always thought were really interesting are those like people who paint or draw who then stream. Basically, sometimes it's digital, sometimes they just have a camera, but it's like basically like just letting people watch their process. Like, I just think that's really interesting. Like, as somebody who, like, if I like just streamed like a Google Doc of me writing, that would make me so anxious.
Well, I've tried doing that before. Yeah. So I'm trying to find ways to do this live stream, like this interview, and in as many ways as I can. And one of those ways I've tried it before was to like live stream a writing event, and like it just is not the same, because like you need so much focus that it just ends up being me with my tongue partially out, like doing, like looking angry. And then you're just watching words flow by. And then I feel like I have to comment on it, which like breaks the flow. And then I'm like, you have to expand, you have to make it like 200% or 300% so anybody can see it. So now the words are way bigger than I like want them to be. And it's a very jarring experience for me. And I don't know, I'm sure that if I talk to an artist and they were like, yeah, it's also jarring for me too. But I can't imagine having to think creatively and then also talk about it, and then also like do it at a high level at the same time and make it interesting.
Right. But that's the thing. I mean, it's like you tend to think about something like that in the context of consuming. So you're thinking like, oh, this needs to be like an entertaining stream, like there needs to be fun stuff happening for people. Like, so it's like an entertainment show. But like really what that is more kind of like, you go to the coffee shop and you see someone who's drawing something interesting, and you're just kind of able to have that kind of voyeuristic, like, oh, that's cool that they're working on that. And like, you could just stand there and stare at them drawing for a while, and it might make them feel a little bit strange that you're just standing there staring at them. But like, ultimately they're not performing in that space. They're just like, hey, if you want, like, I'm here, like we're here together. So
right.
So that's kind of what the Zoom thing is kind of becoming, right? It's like, oh, let's just have spaces like that where we're just here together.
Yeah, I like the idea of the Zoom thing. I feel like I could get into the thing of the Zoom because like I won't feel performative. It's just like a bunch of people like working at the same time. But like when somebody like, hi Lala, how are you? We're just talking to my friend Mark Riechers, podcaster and audio person, and we're talking about technology and streaming and literally the thing we're doing now. It's actually kind of meta. Oh, yeah. So yeah, but I do think that the Zoom meeting like feels less performative. It just feels like, hey, we're all just going to show up and and hang out. But I don't know, maybe I should just think of it like, well, people are just going to come on, and maybe there's some clacking of the keys that is very like soothing to people, and I don't have to perform. Right. And we just all want to kind of be in the same place as other people.
Well, I mean, that's the thing. When it's specifically to writing, I think people who don't write, or maybe write not quite as often, like kind of assume that it just pours out of you, and it's just like, I could spend 2 days writing something that's like 500 words sometimes, and other times I'll write 2,000 or 3,000 word stories in like 40 minutes. So it really depends on. I wish I could explain why, or like so many late nights working on things where I was like, why was that so hard for 12 hours? And then it was super easy, like at that specific moment. And I don't know if it's brain chemistry. I don't know if it's like divine animal spirits. Like it could be anything. So like being able to watch that in real time and know like, oh, like it's okay to struggle when I'm trying to write something. Like sometimes it's just about getting started, or like, yeah, it is. It does kind of feel like witchcraft sometimes, or wizard craft.
That's what Lala is saying right now. I think people who write, it's like wizards. It's magic.
Yeah.
I think that it's like your monkey brain or your lizard brain is like processing all this information, and sometimes it just takes hours for it to go, and then it like clicks.
Yeah.
I've always thought of writing kind of like playing a video game. Like I remember. It's probably, the more I think about it, the more it might not actually have happened in a video game. But I imagine like Lara Croft going into like a room in like a temple, and there's all of these like pegs on the board in front of her, and there's all these cogs underneath it, and like she has to put like all the cogs in the right place for like the door to open, and like writing or figuring this stuff out is kind of like, you put the cog there and it doesn't work, and then the cog over here and it doesn't, when you slowly like build it. And then just by finding all of the angles, it like finally like clicks and unlocks something in some new way that you weren't even thinking about before.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, you're just like, oh, now it couldn't be any other way.
Right.
It just clicked, like it's like, and also just like that things don't kind of come out fully formed. Like I can't say that I've seen too many other people write this way. Like I will write, like I'll outline in this kind of like almost like a code, like I'm kind of building an HTML document, because a lot of my background is in building like web pages and stuff like that too. And it's like you said, you're kind of like grafting on, okay, so like I have, this is my level, and now I need to like fill it in with details. And then I might move the details around, I might move paragraphs around, but like you can kind of still see the end of the level. And it just kind of keeps getting moved here and there until it finally is like, okay, this was the path that it always had to be to get from one end to the other.
Right. And it looks, what did Neil Gaiman say? He said, second drafts are just going back to the first draft and making it look like you knew what you were doing all along. So that's how I feel a lot of times is I just wrote this I did this virtual conference, and I just wrote this big blog post, like 10,000 word blog post about it, like literally the whole process. And like a lot of it was like once I got the outline down and kind of knew where I was going, I was able to write pretty fast, but it took like 2 days to get all of the pieces in the right order and then move them around and then figure it out. But like once it was done, I think I got like 7,000 of the 10,000 words out in that first day. And then like I think I got all 10,000 words out in that one day, but it took 3 days to line all the pieces up in every block and put them in the right place.
Yeah. And then ideally you're probably cutting stuff out, because like sometimes the best way to refine something is by subtraction. I mean, like I think I've written probably way more bad stuff than good stuff, and I just subtract all the bad out of it, hopefully, most of the time.
Yeah, I think that's or smashing it together. I prefer smashing things together, or like most of the things is like, well, I already went through this here a little bit, so like let me just take a little bit of this and then like sort of like push it into this area and expand that out. I found a lot of my early writing, especially in the nonfiction space, was a lot of it was like I would say something at the top, and then I would say the same thing in the middle, and then I would say the same thing at the bottom. And like when I kind of learned like how to mash all of those things together into like one place, like the writing got a lot better and more cohesive. And people enjoyed it more because they wouldn't see the same thing show up throughout the article. Now they would see it, but they would see it in like another way instead of the exact same way. Like they would see it like synthesized into the second part, like a different part of it. So it'd be like, here's how to take this thing and then mold it into this section in here. And I don't know, I think most of the best stuff that I read is like like people just mashing a bunch of like ideas together into new and interesting ways. And I think that it is a lot of cutting, but it's also cutting and like pushing things together in that way that makes something great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, like drawing out connections that people maybe wouldn't see. I think that's a really powerful way to create something interesting. You know, it's like drawing, like that's how you kind of get something brain expanding. You know?
Yeah, I was thinking about this as I was doing this article, because a virtual conference is pretty much just a live stream and a podcast and an in-person conference, and like taking the elements of all of that once Emerald City canceled, and I was like, well, what do I do now? And I was like, wait, my friend was using StreamYard to stream our podcast the other day. And like, I know how to do panels because I've been on a bunch of panels and I interview people with panels. And like, I already know all these creators. And so it was like partially like taking cool parts of my network, taking displaced creators, interviewing stuff for my podcast, and like all of these parts. And I was like, oh, well, like I kind of already unlocked all of this stuff through like just the course of my life. And now it's just explaining, like meshing that together. And then when I started to decompress it after the show, it was like, well, now what I really want to do is show people that they probably have most of the stuff that they need to do this already. And get them motivated to do it, because had I known like that I had 99% of this stuff already, I probably would have done it a lot sooner.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's it's actually I'm that specific phenomenon I'm seeing happen a lot with streaming, because there's, you know, like people, like they see people doing cool, interesting stuff on Twitch. And they just kind of assume there's a lot of gear involved and stuff like that. And now, you know, we're all locked at home and people are like, oh, I want to do like an online concert, or I want to do like a talk show, or all these things. And now, you know, like the tools have never been easier to use. You probably have, if you have a computer, you're probably 70% of the way there. And, you know, like you can always get better gear. There's always better gear than what you're using, but, you know, you can make do with what you have.
And, so I think that this might be fun. This is a good segue into doing things. I think it'll be fun. We should talk about gear if they want to do something, like they want to do a podcast or an audio part or a video. Sure. And I'll give them the like down and dirty recommendation of what I do. And then you can give them like the real recommendation of like, if they wanted to sound like a super professional badass. How does that sound?
Yeah, yes, let's go. Let's do it.
All right. So I have a Blue Yeti microphone and a pop and a pop filter. When I go live, I take my other laptop, my crappy laptop, and these two things, and then I set up live. Or I have another. It's like a Snowball, which is a different Yeti product. And I plug it into my my iPhone, and I record. So both of those things are very, very cheap. I use a program called God, what's it called? It's like an MP3 recorder on my phone when I'm live. The little Snowball thing cost me maybe like $50. And then I needed and it came with a cable. The right now the Blue Yeti is about $130, but I've seen it as low as like $80, and the pop filter was about $10. And that is how I roll. And I've never gotten a complaint. But I felt like when I went, like I want to take it to the next level. So like I want to take it to the level where like this sounds as good as like the best podcast, not just an acceptable podcast, but like the best podcasts that are out there. And Mark is one of the people who I met at the show, Podcast Evolution show, who was very clear about the gear that I should have if I can take it to the other level. In your defense, you weren't like just go burn that mic stuff that you just said like, well, that's really like you should really get some better gear. Like it was a very polite way of saying it. But I'd love to know what I'm getting wrong about the Blue Yeti and what you recommend instead.
Wrong is a strong word. Like it still sounds good. Sometimes it's about expanding the possibility space of what you can do, or getting more for the money you spend, so we do, so I'll speak specifically to field recording because that's most of the kinds of recording I do. So that's like doing interviews with people, generally either on location or, like where the location is kind of part of the story. And I use a Zoom H6 recorder. The reason so it's a field recorder. It's used by, it's one of like 2 or 3 different kinds that a lot of public radio reporters use. And I use it because it has an attachment for some built-in microphones. I like to put a shotgun microphone attachment on it. And then I can plug in I use a Shure. These are all the exact things I recommended to you. So you know that I wasn't pulling your chain. It was a Shure SM57, which is one of a few. It's a microphone that doesn't. So mine is one of the cheaper end handheld microphones, but it's like if you've ever seen a TV reporter or a radio reporter, the microphone that they're holding up in their hand. Actually, I could just show it to you. That's right. There it is. I'm talking on it right now.
Awesome.
Hopefully that I'm doing exactly what I would hate a guest to do, which is play with their microphone. So I'm sorry about that. So I take those 2 things out into the field to conduct interviews, but also to collect sound. So I did a field piece where I was recording an interviewer and our guest who was a bee expert. So with that same piece of equipment, I was able to do a sit-down interview where I plugged two microphones like this one in and then had them on those microphones for their conversation. But then I was able to put the shotgun mic attachment on it, which if you're not familiar with different types of microphones, you don't have to be. It's more just about kind of learning what each of them do. I think the best way to think of a shotgun microphone is kind of like a telephoto lens for audio. Like it's highly directional. You can aim it at something far away and you get a very focused kind of burst. So I took that thing and basically shoved it right into the beehive. Like I got as close to the bees as I could possibly get. There's a ridiculous photo of me in a beekeeper outfit, but I was still wearing shorts, so I don't know how safe I was. The beekeeper was very confident though. She wasn't even wearing any protective gear. But yeah, and I got a lot of really great sound to help that piece that made it a little bit more than just a conversation between 2 people. And that's all with one piece of equipment. I mean, the recorder's like $400.
I think I saw that you could get that the recorder plus like an SD card and a couple of other like accessory things that you might need for a little bit less than $400 on Amazon.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, even the microphones would not be essential, like not right away. But the reason I like that piece of gear and I recommend it to as many people as I can is just that, like, when you have something, so like the setup you described, definitely any USB microphone is going to require a computer. So it's probably, or like a secondary device that you're recording into. So like your phone. So like the phone is a miracle piece of technology, the smartphone, because it really can stand in pretty well for a lot of different things. But just having that one recorder that you can plug a whole bunch of different kinds of microphones into that is very reliable, because it's like if you're somebody who's creating stuff by yourself, you want to know that something is going to work 100% of the time. If there's a possibility, every new piece of equipment you introduce is a failure point. So if you have your phone and you have a microphone, if your phone crashes or if the microphone goes sideways on you, like your interview is gone right there. That's a problem. But if you have one of those field recorders, you can find ways to adapt. Like if your microphone stops working, you have one on the body, and like it kind of gives you more flexibility. You can also plug that into your computer and then use it the same way that you're using your Yeti right now. So that's, 3 possible, I guess in the context of like, maybe if you were covering a convention, you can use it as a field recorder and you can get some sound of people kind of milling around, or maybe like in an artist alley, you can get kind of people talking, like some of that stuff that makes a produced piece, which, and our show is really different than this, just having a conversation. Like our show is about sometimes someone telling a story. It's, it's highly edited. Somebody take an hour conversation might get edited down to like 7 minutes. So like you need that stuff to draw the richness out of it. And it takes a lot of time. I mean, like that's something that I think you should never think like, oh, well, there's either the podcast where it's just 2 people talking on microphones, or This American Life. Like there's a whole huge area that you can experiment with. And gear is all about giving you more tools to do that. It's like just opening up more possibilities.
Yeah, and I actually was on a podcast a couple of weeks ago with my friends at Fanbase Press, and I noticed they used an H6 as their studio setup, but they also do field recording as well at shows. So it can do field, as you mentioned, and I watched it do recordings as well in studio. Yeah. And each one had its own little separate track and that they were playing with, and you can actually instead of having to rely on the sound going into the mic, into the computer, and then doing it in post, you can actually control the volume level, like before it even gets to the computer, and make sure that it all sounds good together.
Well, and the other thing is, pointing out that it's a multi-track recorder too. Like, depending on how much editing you actually do, like if you go into a program like Pro Tools is what we use. I think a lot more people probably use Adobe Audition because it's a little bit more available, or even like Reaper. Like if everything is kind of compressed into one track, it limits how much editing flexibility you have. Like you can't, if I on your recording am way louder than you for whatever reason, it might be hard for you to fix that if it's all recorded together, but you could just adjust it in post. If you have us all on separate tracks like that, and having a piece of equipment that facilitates that for you, it's one less thing that can go wrong. It's going to give you that flexibility later. But it also, because it has the volume controls on the device, it's like you can kind of get like 80% of the way there automatically. And then the fine grain, you're freeing up kind of mental space for like when instead of having to fix your audio, you're just improving it and enhancing it, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that were I to do like a narrative show or a show like you're talking about, I certainly would want to invest in all of those things, because you want to like have the best chance of succeeding and the best chance of having having the best audio quality. If audio is the thing that you're going to drive the narrative forward, you need to have the best version of it.
Yeah. So I will say this though, just because we're actually at a really interesting time for radio, because about a week ago, probably a little before that, we started getting emails from studios that's like, if we're out in the field, that's one kind of interview you do, but kind of our stock and trade is we will tell, like I'm interviewing an author next week, and he was supposed to go to a studio in Minnesota, a public radio studio, and then our studio would connect with that one, and we wouldn't be able to see each other, but there would be a direct connection. So it would be basically like the highest fidelity Skype call you've ever been on. None of those studios are taking guests now. They're all in social distancing mode. They are not even sure, like our studios we're not allowed to be there. So all of that gear is now cut off, and all of a sudden we have to get creative, just like podcasters do. Like we have to figure out, well, with what we have available and what our guests have available, how can we get the best possible sound? And like the thing we keep going back to is like the voice memo app on an iPhone. The iPhone microphone is actually really good. So, if you want to interview somebody and you're worried about how a Skype call is going to sound, like, maybe you can tell them like, hey, call me on Skype and then record yourself using an iPhone. And then it's really about kind of controlling the situation, right? It's like, okay, well, if you put it on a stack of books and it's a few inches from your face and you try to do it at a desk so you're not moving too much, just email me the file after the interview and it will make you sound 100 times better. And then it's kind of more about like communicating that with somebody that you're trying to tell their story. So, I mean, like there's a gear component of it that's really important, but like ultimately this is about kind of best representing who you're talking to with what you have available.
Yeah, it's an interesting time. It's an interesting time to do to go about this. So, okay, so now we have the gear. There's also, I should mention that if you're going to do studio, there's also a Rodecaster Pro, which is kind of like the studio. It's a bigger and it looks more like a mixing board. It's not nearly as handheld, but I was told by multiple people that was like kind of the Mac Daddy thing. If you wanted to make sure that like you had the best, like if you're going out to a location and let's say to do a live show or something, that like that's the one that you really, if you can get it, that's the one that you need. But it's like close to $700 to get that one.
Yeah. I mean, and that's the other thing is like you could add a mixing board to the H6 setup at some point. If you were like, oh, I need the ability to like, maybe I need 8 microphones and there's only 4 ports on the Zoom. The mixing board, maybe a cheaper mixing board would actually get you there, but then you have 2 pieces of equipment. So you have 2 points of failure. So you're always kind of playing that game of like, how complicated do I want my situation to be versus like what possibilities does it open up? Like the reason that thing is $700 is because it solves a lot of problems in one device. Like the more one device can do for you, the more you're going to probably end up paying for it.
Absolutely. And there's also there's also a difference between the kinds of mics that you want in studio and live is what I heard. I heard that if you want, this goes above my pay grade for this thing, but like that you want a dynamic mic if you are in studio more and you want a different kind of mic if you're in the field or vice versa. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's correct. Let's like I think a cardioid pattern is usually what you want in the field. A lot of that comes down to pickup in terms of like a cardioid microphone. I could be interviewing you in a really, really, really noisy crowd. And as long as I had it like right up in your mouth, like in your face, like it would still be like, it wouldn't get blown out the way that different kinds of microphones, like a performance microphone, a dynamic microphone is an even narrower pickup pattern. But it's kind of a flatter sound. So like basically the more sensitive a microphone is, the more background sound it's going to pick up, but the richer the main sound it picks up will be. So like in studio, condenser microphones are really nice. But they require, like if I had a condenser microphone in this room, you would definitely hear the fact that I have like heat coming on every once in a while, and you'd probably hear echo in the room. Like that's the kind of microphone that you in the studio that's got like all the eggshell soundproofing all around it. Like that's the kind of microphone you'd probably see there. Some of that's also about consistency. Like we have a specific microphone that the host of our show records everything on, and pretty much we'll put it in the field, we'll put it in her home. And then it's just about listening to, okay, is this in this context, does this microphone sound good? Like, does it sound the way that it's supposed to? So like a lot of that, again, it's not about necessarily having the right microphone, but having a microphone that you understand the limitations and the trade-offs of.
Absolutely.
I think a dog was trying to get in my office.
That's okay. My dog tries to do the same thing. So we talked about gear. I would be remiss if I didn't ask you, once you have the gear, so you've got the gear now, the next thing you're probably going to have to deal with, or like the last real thing, we're going to take editing off the table because we're nearing our hour together. But I do want to talk about interviewing guests, because you're probably going to either be interviewing guests or having a co-host. Generally is how most of these podcasts work. Not saying that you won't have one that's just you talking into the mic, but that seems to be the least common form of podcast that that I, especially in this world where we're seeking connection, this is kind of the theme of this podcast episode. I'm going to keep it to like, you want to connect with either co-hosts or you want to connect with someone you're interviewing, and specifically interviewing. Do you have any tips for conducting interviews, making the person feel comfortable and getting what you want?
Sure. Well, there's a few things. I mean, like some of them are resource based. Like if you can have somebody helping you out with recording, if that's a possibility, that's going to free up brain space for you to just connect with your guest. Since most of the time when I've been podcasting, that's not always an option. The next best thing is just to have a setup, like really know, like I know how my recorder works. I went to the place where I'm recording it, or, you know, like I know my setup at home really well. Like basically that you try to eliminate as many unknowns as possible and just really know what to expect, so that when you have your time with your guest, you're really just focused on them. Something similar, and this is something in my before I got into audio, I was a print journalist, and, you know, like I would write my questions as like here's a series of pieces of information I'm interested about, or like, I know, like, you know, like I can get a decent soundbite out of their answer to these questions, but, you know, like most of the time it's like, here's a list of questions I want the answers to, with there's some through line between them, but not necessarily a ton. It's kind of like, let's get the info dump out of this person while I have their time. The first time I tried to do that for a radio interview, the senior producer who I was working with was just like, no person would have a conversation like this. Like you would not just shout a bunch of questions at somebody and not acknowledge, you know, like the worst sin you can do is like you ask someone a really deep, thoughtful question and they start answering like humanly to you, and then you look down at your notes and you're like looking at your next question, and like there is always a degree of this plate spinning act when you're a really good interviewer of like, well, you have to be thinking about what you want to ask next, but you have to think about it more in the context of the conversation that you're having. You know, you have to stay present for the person that you want to connect with, because that's what's going to make them feel comfortable revealing things that maybe they wouldn't normally talk about. I mean, like we interview a lot of authors, and there's this, like, we have like some of the best interviewers who do this kind of work on our show. And like, they can really break people out of the, like, here are the 5 things I tell everyone about this book that I'm talking to, you know, like they will say like they will have done their homework and know like, hey, Philip Pullman, like you're interested in this idea of panpsychism. What is that about? You know, like having done, like doing your homework so you can keep the gears turning, not doing your homework so you can prove that you did your homework, if that makes sense. Like that's really what will take you far. Like it's kind of like how you would never, you know, you'd want to, at least if you were going to meet someone for coffee, like you wouldn't just show up and then not know anything about that person, or, you know, you would try to be like, let's kind of like start where we're both at, and we can kind of go, you know, you wouldn't say like, the first question you'd say would not be like, oh, I heard, you know, like this thing happened to you on Facebook, what's up with that? You know, like you would ease into that kind of thing.
Absolutely. That sounds great. I actually have, you can't see it when you're listening to this podcast, but like I have a list of, this is just my list of all the questions that I wanted to ask. It's not really actually, that.
And that's, I think you're doing it perfectly right, which is that it's just a bunch of words. Like, it's just to remind you where you want to go. You know, like I would write fully formed questions, which is like that made me a really stilted interviewer when I first tried to do it on the air, you know, but having that thing of like, here are the things I know I want to cover. Like, I think that's part of really doing your homework.
Yeah, I thought of like a mind cloud, or like a brain, whatever I think it's called, the mind cloud. I don't do like the corporate work, but I think they call it like a mind cloud or a brain cloud, where you just put the words that you want to, that you like associate with this person, that you, and I always try to talk to people who I've met before or talked to before, so that like I don't have to do so much work. We've already had like that conversation. I just have to go and look up some information on them, read a couple of articles on them, and then remember like what I wanted to talk about. Because usually what happens is, I would assume this happens with everybody who interviews from what I talk to, but you know, you listen to somebody or you meet somebody or you talk to somebody and you go, wow, that would be a really interesting conversation to have on the show, or that person would. So you're probably already have a trigger of like why, even if you're just cold emailing somebody, like why you're cold emailing them. It's not, it could just be because like they're a famous author, but like still that would give you some sense of where you wanted the show to go. But I found that the longer that I did the show, like the better I got at like knowing what the people wanted, because I would talk to the people long enough and I would talk to my fans for long enough that they would like they would tell me what their favorite interviews were. And then I would be like, oh, I should, like, they really like it when I get deep on these sorts of topics. But when you're first starting out, that's not going to be a thing that you like have access to. So I always just like to find interesting people in my own life, or that are doing the thing that I like to do, or usually people that I've met at a show or listened to on a podcast or met at a party who do something interesting and say, that would be like a really good interview. And then they're kind of already broken down a little bit. Like it's not like that first moment is. Right. And I will say that like even having the video, I was skeptical of having the video, but I can say that like having the video really does help like break down the barrier that you normally get from audio in a very real way, the times that I've used it.
Yeah, I that's something I think is really interesting that's kind of changing, because like, you know, most of the old school producers I work with, like they didn't have that option, and they've kind of developed this really authoritative voice of like this way of connecting to people as a voice, as a disembodied voice. And so now if they have the video option, you know, it's open, but like their style will change. Like they, you know, we do sometimes on stage interviews, or, you know, like I think it does make them a little bit more present, you know, like they aren't kind of going deep into their research in their head while they're like the disembodied public radio voice. They're like really, really staying with the story that somebody's sharing. Which leads to these really intimate moments, you know? And so it's cool that that can be mediated in a way that doesn't require us being on a stage together. You know, it sounds so simple because it's like, oh yeah, of course video would make it seem more personal, but like you can't really overestimate how much of an impact that has on how you're going to connect with somebody.
And you always say, yeah, it's helpful, but like, how helpful is it? I think it's like, it's also, well, how much better is it to have video than that? How much better is it to have an H6 than to have a Yeti? Like, what is the gulf between those two things? And hi, Rye. Thanks for listening on Twitch. I can say that when I do that without the video, I am constantly like looking for other things to do. Like when they're listening, I'm preparing for the next question, or I'm like trying to listen to, or like the phone will vibrate or like that. But when you're doing it on video, you don't have that option, because like everybody can see what you're doing, including the guest, and like just going over to your phone and scrolling through is like super rude. So and even if it's not super rude, it will be perceived as super rude. So you end up like being in this bubble. And I'm very like, the reason I brought this show back was so I could have interesting conversations with people I wanted to talk to, and anything I can do to be more present in that moment, I think helps the interview. And hopefully it helps the people that are at home listening as well. And it helps you if you're planning to do a podcast or a radio show or something like that.
This is a very simple, dumb thing, but like we actually just have a little Post-it that we put up in the studio that just says, look here. And then that's, so like when you don't have the video, it's like, it's almost like a meditation, right? It's like, I'm going to meditate on that spot so I can really, because anything you're touching or putting into your brain is really taking you out of the moment. And like, you know, some people have this great skill where they can kind of snap to something else and then snap right back into the conversation. I find that that's a little bit rare. Most people don't really think that way, you know, like it's easy to get knocked out of having that connection with somebody. And like, if you're really getting into it and getting deep on something, that's the perfect way to lose it. So you want to stay present.
Absolutely. All right. So we're nearing the end of our hour, and I wanted to move to your show that you produce. And because we're all in this time, I assume when this goes live in a couple of weeks, we're still going to be on lockdown. And so we're all looking for more media to consume and more things to hopefully take our mind off of this and give us new experiences. So why don't you take us through your show and tell us what it is it's about?
Sure. So I am a producer on 2 different public radio podcasts. One is the main show. It's called To the Best of Our Knowledge. It's been a public radio program since 1990, I think. And it's been a podcast since at least 2001. So they've been doing it for a long time. And the thing I really love about it is it's really just a show about curiosity. We're a public radio show that puts the world through a kaleidoscope of ideas, is the way we like to put it. So like you might have a show about bees that's talking about bees in terms of like a local ecosystem type story, and like somebody who's like why we need to nurture bees in our local environment. You might have somebody who then talks about like the psychology and like hive behavior of bees, but then also like the economic impact of like, what does it mean if people can have a beehive that they maintain in like inner city Detroit? We've had shows about psychedelic experiences and how they can either open your mind in like creative ways, but also like maybe as a possible treatment for depression. We've had shows about socialism, we're working on a show about skin and skincare. So it kind of just runs the total gamut, but the overwhelming theme is going deep on a specific topic. So that's every week on possibly your public radio station, but also our website at ttbook.org. The second podcast is kind of a spin-off called Bookmarks, which is at the end of a lot of those interviews, we will just ask an author like, hey, can you tell a story, just a short story about how a book just profoundly changed your life, or like just something like a book that really, really left an impact on you. And it's a great way to kind of knock someone off of their feet a little bit, because the people who like great writers especially tend to be really, really great readers. They have books that they've affected people in ways that you maybe wouldn't expect. So they're usually like 3-minute episodes. Our most recent season, the first episode is with Philip Pullman, who wrote the His Dark Materials series. But his book is, it's 3 minutes, so it's not really like I'm spoiling it, but his book is just a pocket atlas. Like it's not like an authored book, but the reason is because when he was a kid, he would like basically chart. He was kind of a military brat, and he would kind of use it to kind of orient where he's been in the world. And then later on, when he was actually working on Dark Materials series, like he still has an atlas that he pulls out and lays out, and like he kind of models fictional locations on real world locations. So it's this kind of creative tool that he kind of started leaning on at an early age. But like, it's not even a book you would think about as a book you would read, but it's really interesting to hear how it affected him. So we have, I think there's 13 episodes of that up right now, and then we'll have another 13 coming out in the coming weeks. So
yeah, listen to a couple of them. They were I really liked that one because cool. I did not know what to expect. So it was just like your favorite author talking about a book that influenced them for a couple of minutes, and like it got to me a couple of times. It was great.
Yeah, no, they're cool. They're fun. They're really short. They're great for heavy podcast listeners because they're just another 3 minutes. We don't want to take too much of your time, but it's nice to go deep on something. You know, the author is doing all the talking. We don't have any interviewers on the show, other than our host, Anne Strainchamps, is kind of telling you who they are and kind of setting you on the chart with their story. But other than that, it's just kind of the author sharing what they have to share. But you can find all that stuff at ttbook.org/bookmarks, all the info for that one.
Awesome. Well, it was great having you on. I'm going to use the question I use to end every podcast, which is tell us the best piece of advice that you've ever gotten for building your creative career, And it could be something you talked about already. Could be something brand new. And then where we can find you specifically, if you have a social media presence, and then we'll say goodbye.
Sure. I think the best advice I got was when I first got into radio, but I think it kind of applies to anything creative you want to do, which was just book it. Just book it. Like it's, I would get in my head about like, oh, well, we can't interview. Like at the time, I really wanted to do a show with Zoe Quinn, who is at the center of Gamergate, and that I just, like given my interest in digital spaces, like she had a really traumatic experience in a bunch of different digital spaces. And that was the thing I wanted to talk about. And, this particular producer, he was really like, you know what, you should just go for it. Like you like sometimes you talk to somebody, it's okay for an idea to not be fully formed is kind of the point. Like if you really feel like in your gut, like, okay, there's something here. It's exciting. It feels deep. I'm curious to learn more about it. Like that's a really good sign, and you should follow that instinct and be true to it. And don't necessarily feel like something has to be perfect before you're going to pursue it and go like, and try to produce something interesting for the world, and if you put it out and it's not perfect, that's fine. I mean, it's like you just have to be able to look at it with a really clear eye and say like, well, what about this was I really happy with, and what about it could go better next time? And that's really the only way to create anything worthwhile, is that you have to like go for it. You have to book it. You have to like use the microphone you have on your desk, and then next time, just tweak what you feel like you need to tweak.
Awesome. I love it. Is there a place that people could find you specifically if they want to connect with you?
Sure. So probably I am on Twitter entirely too much, at Mark on Fire. And then I'm running all the social accounts for the show. So we're at TT Book on Twitter, Instagram. Yeah. And then ttbook.org is where the show is. So
awesome. Wonderful. It was so nice to have you on, Mark. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. This was great.
And now I'm going to see if I can somehow end this broadcast without destroying this connection, so I can just say goodbye. But we'll see. Maybe I'll be saying goodbye to you forever, or for the thing, or maybe I'll be able to keep you on the air or in like the back end. Hang on a second. Let's see.